Hello everyone, my name's Garry Oels. This is another video in a series of videos I'm preparing based on the scenarios in my new book, Wellington at Bay, the Battle of Villamuriel, 25th of October 1812, which recounts the biggest battle during the retreat from Burgos at the end of the 1812 campaign in the peninsula. There are three scenarios in the book, and this playthrough will take one of the options from scenario 3, Wellington's counterattack at the end of the day. In this option, I use a tweak on the way the light infantry are represented using the Brunswick, the Duke of Brunswick Oels light infantry. This slide shows the campaign map with the British having retired from Burgos through Torquemada, where both armies took a lot of pleasure from the local wine, through to Magas, and then the British themselves formed a line on the Carrion from Palencia in the north through Villamuriel de Crato to Duenas on the Puisega. The French, by the evening of the 24th of October, had got as far as Magas in the centre of the map. And the following morning, on the 25th, Macoun, who was in charge of both his divisions and Gauthier's division, was sent as the advance guard. He himself went to Villamuriel de Crato via Calabazanos, while Gautier attacked the bridge at Tariego. This is the battlefield that we'll be seeing in 15 mil scale in a few moments, and there are several points of interest. The village itself features a quite substantial church, but other than that, at the time had only about 100 houses. It was on the main carriage road from Palencia to Duenas, and the other main habitation was the monastery at Calabazanos. In terms of crossing the river, that was only possible at the two fords marked here and the bridge. The weather had been quite bad in the preceding week with a lot of rain, so the river was running fast and deep. The other big feature of the battlefield, second only to the river, is the dry Canal de Castilla, which was under construction when the war broke out, and so consequently was unfinished and was empty. It's a significant feature such that men standing in the bottom of the canal can't see out, so it's quite an obstacle. Another feature of the battlefield were these wine vaults or bodegas, which created some rough ground on the western side of the canal. These vaults were quite extensive excavations. Some are reported to have had 100 steps underground, and basically they provided rough ground for skirmishers to defend. And the other feature of significance on the battlefield was the high ground. It rose from about 715 meters by the river up to 800 meters. Orders of battle for the day. The Allied force constituted the 5th Anglo-Portuguese division, and they were under some new commanders. So Major General John Oswald arrived that morning to take command. Edward Barnes wasn't officially in command of the brigade for another 2 days, but had arrived just in time to take part in the battle. The division was supported by a brigade of the Galician Army of Spain, the 6th Army. So all told, they had 5,500 men with 6 guns. The French were comprised of the 5th Division of the Army of Portugal, led by General Division Macoun. This was the division beaten by the 5th Anglo-Portuguese Division at Salamanca just a few months earlier. The division comprised 2 brigades, each of 2 regiments, each of 2 battalions, and they also had 5 foot guns in support. Also supporting the division were the Light Cavalry Brigade of Defos, which comprised 6 squadrons of light cavalry plus a small detachment of a further regiment. This brigade was actually Curto's brigade, who was currently away commanding the division. The whole force was supported by Suham's 1st Reserve Horse Artillery Company and with 5 guns. So in total, the French had just under 6,000 men and 10 guns. So when we look at the deployment of those troops on the map, the significant feature is that earlier in the day, Macoun had sent Darnold's brigade across the river. They'd managed to make a partial repair of the bridge, which had been destroyed by Wellington's engineers, and he'd deployed the 15th line extensively in skirmish order, and they'd got across the canal and were threatening the British position and the Spanish position, specifically on the Anglo-Allied left. Montfort's brigade, as you'll see, hardly takes any part in the battle at all. So as far as the game rules are concerned, I use Black Powder 2nd edition for this game. I use 15mm figures and therefore the centimetre scale, where every distance in the rulebook is measured in centimetres rather than inches. I also use the special rule from Last Argument of Kings, where no firing is allowed if the unit has moved more than once during the term, which I think has been adopted in Clash of Eagles as well. For generals, there are several general options for generals in Black Powder 2. I'm not a big fan of rerolls on command tests, so mainly because it has the effect of increasing the staff rating by 1 in the overall result. So I prefer to use the original rule for generals, wherein the division commander in this case can give orders to units that otherwise wouldn't get them. I've also used the staff ratings as a way of encouraging historical behaviour in the generals during the game. So for instance, Spry didn't move at all off the hill all day, so I've given him a staff rating of 6, which means it's unlikely, he'll fail more often than he won't. Another feature of this battle that is not common to a lot of Peninsular War battles is that the villages, in this case the Villamuriel and Calabazanos, can't actually be garrisoned, and the reason for this is that both sides actually mounted guards to prevent the troops going into the buildings, because the wine had been harvested and was all over the village in the houses, so there'd been significant drunkenness in the march through Torquemada in both armies. So consequently the buildings can't be garrisoned in the game and can only be passed through by units in skirmish order or march column. And finally, I do skirmishes slightly differently from the main rules, which I'll show next. Differently, this shows how I represent skirmishes. I use these 6cm movement trays, which show the correct frontage and depth for a deployed skirmish company. So a French company of 4 figures or 130 men in this would have 2 of these bases. And I also give skirmishers light cover if they've moved less than 6 centimetres to represent the effect of the greater dispersion than is allowed for in the rules. The game itself lasts 8 game turns or 2 hours from 4 p.m. in the evening. The sun will have set by the end of turn 6, and the 8th turn ends in complete darkness after civil twilight. The Allied army moves first. So this refight is different to some of the other videos in that the British light infantry companies have been returned to their parent battalions at the start of the counterattack, which left the 2 Duke of Brunswick Oels light infantry companies combining in their attack on the village itself. So in terms of victory conditions, the Allies, specifically John Oswald, was told by Wellington to drive the enemy from the right bank of the river. So consequently, his victory condition is to advance the banks of the Carrion without the division being broken, in black powder terms, and the fate of Lenion's rather fragile brigade does not count towards the army morale of the Allies. On the other hand, the French have a simple task, which is to repulse the Allied attack, breaking both the British brigades while remaining on the right bank of the Carrion. In reality, the French were quickly forced back onto the other bank of the Carrion, so it's actually quite difficult to judge how much of a fight they were prepared to put up, but for the sake of the game, I've set this as the victory condition. This is a view of the battlefield as I've recreated it in 15mm scale. I've used a large amount of the Callistra Hexon terrain, and the Canal de Castilla, which I referred to earlier on, carves across the middle of the battlefield using the Callistra World War I trench system, which works quite well for this because it doesn't have a lot of trenchy detail moulded on the inside of the ditch. And I've used a lot of liching just to blend it into the terrain and give it a bit more height so that it replicates the not being able to see out of the canal feature. The roads and river sections are all from Timecast, and the buildings are a mixture of JR from Manchester Militant and hovels. On the left you can see a photograph of a view from the high ground, and this looks across towards the bridge. It gives you some view of the height that is a bit lost in these war games representations. The ground rises up probably 8 or 9 hexon heights, but it's still more compatible with 2mm scale figures than 15. This shows the French left, which is made in 3 parts. On the left you can see Montfort's brigade standing, waiting. He's actually himself across the river with some skirmishers. One of his brigades, one of his battalions rather, is deployed as a light infantry mixed battalion, as in Clash of Eagles. Next to them on this side of the river is the light cavalry brigade waiting patiently, and to the right obviously the artillery, which combines his Macon's own foot artillery with the horse artillery from the reserve. So opposing them on the Allied right, you can see Spry's brigade of 4 battalions deployed in line with the broken 8th Cazadores behind them. On their left comes Barnes's brigade, organised of 3 battalions, organised in column as ordered by Wellington, and on their left are the 2 companies of the Brunswick Oels light infantry, ready to advance on the village, and then the artillery of Robert Lawson's brigade of the 8th Battalion of the Royal Artillery. So this photograph shows the French right. On the left of the photograph, as you look at it, you can see half of the one of the Voltigeur battalions of the 15th Ligne. Next to them is the 1st Battalion of the 15th Ligne, deployed in light infantry mixed formation as before, and next to them was their 2nd Battalion of the 15th Ligne, also deployed in the same formation. Across from them, at the bottom of the picture, you can see Helian's 2 Battalion Spanish Brigade, with its Cazadores guarding the flank, and to their right are the 1st Battalion of the 9th Foot, which, as described by one of their own officers, was detached from Barnes's brigade, its parent brigade, during the day, and occupied a pseudo light infantry role during the day. The infantry next to them, between them and Lawson's artillery, is the Brigade of Pringle, comprising another 3 battalions. This photograph gives you an overview of the battlefield at the end of Allied Turn 1, and you in particular can get a better view of the French Voltigeurs and Grenadiers attempting to unsettle the Spanish brigade on the British left. So this shows a close-up of Helian's brigade during Turn 1. They've succeeded with their command role and advanced 1 move down the steep slopes, which restricts their movement to 8 centimetres instead of the normal 12. In the centre, Pringle's brigade with the 1st 9th attached were more successful in their command role. They moved 2 moves. Pringle's a slightly better commander, and the British troops are all reliable veterans, so they're more likely to move, and they've moved to get engaged with the French skirmishers around the Bodega area. In this photograph, you can see that the Brunswick Oels light infantry on the left of the picture have advanced down into the canal, but Barnes, being an aggressive brigade commander, has urged his columns onwards across the canal, and the 1st Battalion of the 38th Foot on the left there has charged the leading French skirmishers from the 2nd Battalion, 15th Ligne. And that battalion evaded and so have disappeared back towards the riverbank, past their sub-commander, obviously executing a good withdrawal away from the 1st 38th, who could only just reach them, and therefore they've escaped. So we now move on to the end of French Turn 1, and here you can see the skirmish fire from the skirmishers on the French right have managed to score some casualties on the Cazadores guarding the Spanish flank, and have shaken them and disordered them. In the centre, the French skirmishers have retired to the edge of the canal and open fire on the advancing British infantry battalions, and have already scored a casualty. Meanwhile, on the French left, things haven't gone terribly well for the leading French skirmishers. They've failed their command test and are unable to get out of the way. And you can see at the bottom of the picture Spry's brigade, which I didn't mention in the Allied turn because they basically didn't move, watching on from afar. So we're now at the end of Allied turn 2 here on the Allied left, and you can see that Helion's brigade has failed its command test and has not advanced any further down the hill. However, it wasn't all bad news for the Spanish. They did manage to disorder the skirmishers facing them, although they didn't cause any casualties. Meanwhile, in the centre, at the end of Allied turn 2, despite having his troops having a reliable special rule and his reasonable staff rating of 8, Pringle didn't manage to get his brigade to close with the French skirmishers any further during this. Barnes's men, on the other hand, continued their way forward, at least the 1st Battalion of the 38th, who charged again at the skirmishers they were facing and have chased them back towards the ford, although we're not able to catch them and destroy them. However, Barnes also wanted his other 2 battalions to charge the skirmishers facing them from the Grenadiers and Voltigeurs of the 66th Ligne, but they failed their command role, and that was despite being reliable and Barnes getting a +1 extra for being an aggressive commander. Spry, however, managed to get his men forward despite having a very poor command rating of 6 to reflect their inactivity during the day. He's got his men forward a move down the slope. So here at the end of the French turn 2, the French skirmish battalion, the 2nd 15th Ligne, has retired further back towards Lawson's Mound and taken up a position there where their close order troops are covered from the artillery, and they're prepared for the oncoming assault of Pringle's brigade. On the French left, the French artillery couldn't resist the target offered by the 1st Battalion 38th, who they've caused a couple of casualties to and disordered them as they crossed their front. Meanwhile, the skirmishers of the Voltigeurs and the Grenadiers of the 2nd Battalion of the 15th Ligne crossing the ford, those of the 66th have stayed in position confronting Barnes's other 2 battalions. On the extreme French left, Montfort has reformed his Voltigeurs and Grenadiers into line formation, ready to face off against the 1st Battalion of the 38th Foot and any more of Barnes's brigade that get across the canal. Now at the end of Allied turn 3, Helion's brigade is still on the hill overlooking the French skirmishers as it's once again failed its command test, but they are engaging in musketry duels from the 2 sets of skirmishers. Meanwhile, in the centre, Pringle's brigade has managed to advance to the edge of the canal, didn't quite have a movement to get any further, and so they are facing off against the French skirmishers there. The Brunswick light infantry you can see on the right of the picture, just by the edge of the village, have managed to disorder the encroaching French skirmishers. On the Allied right, the aggressive leadership of Barnes has paid off, and the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Foot have charged the other battalion of Voltigeurs and Grenadiers of the 66th Line, and managed to catch them in their evade and destroyed them. And in the background you can see Spry's brigade has advanced steadily to the edge of the banks of the canal, ready to cross it. Here we are at the end of French turn 3, and the only significant change here is that in the centre the 2 battalions of the 66th Linear have retired towards the bridge and the ford to create some room, given that the 2nd 15th has also fallen back. The French artillery had a good and successful turn. They fired on the 1st 38th Foot and caused excess casualties, which precipitated a break test which the 1st 38th managed to fail, and they disappeared from the field. Meanwhile, the Voltigeurs of the 86th Linear, led by Montfort, advanced to cover the ford from the encroaching British infantry. So we're now at the end of Allied turn 4, and on the Allied left, Helion remains on the Allied side of the canal, observing the French skirmishers. In the centre, Pringle had sent the battalion formed of the 2nd 30th Foot and the 2nd 44th Foot in to charge the French skirmishers of the 2nd 15th Linear, and they charged him but were disordered by the closing fire and forced to retreat back to the banks of the canal. Pringle also tried to rally the shaken battalion of the 1st 9th Foot, who had been shaken by the skirmish fire, but he was unsuccessful this time. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion of the 4th Foot had moved up to support the charging infantry, and were left to face the French alone. On the Allied right flank, the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Foot, supported by the 2nd Battalion of the 38th Foot and all of Spry's brigade, which had managed to cross the canal, were facing off against the skirmishers of the 86th Linear, formed in line to try and cover the ford, and had caused some casualties on them. So, right, we're now at the end of French turn 4, and the first thing that's happened is that Montfort has pulled his battalion from the 86th Linear back to the ford, while trying to keep some fire on the encroaching allies. Meanwhile, the French artillery have continued to bombard the British infantry and have had a good turn, shaking the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Foot, and that means that the Barnes's brigade is now a broken brigade and will have to retire. On the other flank, the French skirmishers keep up the harassing fire on the British and Spanish infantry around the canal. And Macoun, seeing the initial repulse of the British infantry, clearly thinks his chance of winning this, and has brought forward the 2 battalions of the 66th Linear to support the 2nd 15th. We now move forward to the end of Allied turn 5, and Helion's brigade is exchanging musket fire with the skirmishers across the canal, disordering the nearest ones without doing much damage in the way of casualties. Meanwhile, in the centre, Pringle, perhaps rashly, had sent in the 1st Battalion of the 4th Foot in to try and dislodge the 2nd 15th Linear from Lawson's Mound, and unfortunately came off worse in the in the close combat, reeling back to the banks of the canal, shaken and disordered. Meanwhile, the Duke of Brunswick's Oels light infantry companies, the 2nd and 10th companies, went through the town, the village rather, to try and start sniping at the French infantry from the flank and the artillery, should that become. On the Allied right, Barnes has no option but to withdraw his shaken brigade from the fight. Spry, on the other hand, continues to harass the 86th Ligne as Montfort retires them towards the ford. At the end of French turn 5, Montfort has been singularly unsuccessful at getting his infantry back across the ford, so they're stuck and now shaken, awaiting more terrible things from Spry's infantry. In the centre, the 2nd Battalion of the 15th Ligne have charged off their hill in following up the 1st Battalion of the 4th, beat them in the melee and managed to break them in the subsequent break test. And in order to see off the Duke of Brunswick's Oels light infantry, the 6th Battalion of the 66th Ligne has moved across to be ready to take them out next turn. Meanwhile, on the French right, the skirmishing continues between the Spanish line infantry and the French skirmishers without much result either way. So we're now at the end of Allied turn 6, and the casualties and defeats suffered by Pringle's brigade meant that his brigade was also broken in the last French turn. So with 2 of the brigades broken, in the Allied army was also broken, and so each brigade has to start retiring, including, as you can see here, Spry's a relatively unengaged one. And also Barnes's brigade continues to retire back across the open ground towards the canal. In the centre, Pringle's brigade starts the slow process of crossing back across the canal and retiring up the slopes. Likewise, Helion takes his infantry back up the slope in order to comply with the broken army rules. So here you can see, although the game was slated to last 8 turns, at the end of Allied turn 6 the game is all but over, and it was the picture when the game. So reviewing the victory conditions for the game, the Allies were tasked with getting to the edge of the river, driving the French off, while the French had to repulse the Allied attack. And as is obvious, the Allies didn't achieve their conditions while the French did, leading to a French win. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. As I said at the beginning, the research done to set up the game and is all covered in this book, Wellington at Bay, which you can obtain from Helion. It goes into a lot of detail about how the battle was fought and who was there and what sort of experience the soldiers had and how they fought tactically as well. Hopefully this will be out in the next month or two once the COVID-19 stuff is over, and I certainly recommend you subscribe to my channel, because I tend to produce a number of videos like this with regard to both scenarios for this book, for this game, for this book, are in this book, and also for my other publications, Wellington's First Battle, which is about the Battle of Boxtel in 1794, and other games, future coming books on Lincelles in 1793, and also Toulon in 1793. So please subscribe, there's plenty to look forward to. Thank you for watching.